Today is Friday, March 14th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Vladimir Putin responds to that ceasefire proposal. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We'd love to hear from you. We're getting through the news of the cray each and every weekday, bright and early. Joining me today, CBN's Billy Hallowell, Tragon's Phillips, and a lot to get to as always. And Billy, you're looking into Syria today on The Focus.
Yes, we are looking at an interview we did with Joel Veldkamp. He's breaking down essentially what is to come and what just happened. Lots to talk about there.
All right, and coming up on the main thing, Democrats, since President Trump was elected, they seem pretty disorganized and struggling to sort of mount a unified response to the second term of Donald Trump. CBN's David Brody takes a closer look at that on today's main thing. The news in 90 is up next, right after this.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem, and the city is restless. The people of Israel welcome Jesus as king, his followers ready for revolution. But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! How will you escape being condemned to hell?
Experience Holy Week like never before.
What have you done?
Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen, Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
And pro-Hamas protesters stormed Trump Tower in Manhattan yesterday, demanding the release of Mahmoud Khalil, who's an anti-Israel activist detained by ICE. NYPD officers arrested 98 people within just 2 hours, charging them with trespassing. Khalil's a Columbia University graduate student who was arrested at his campus-owned apartment on Saturday. The Trump administration has labeled him a national security risk, citing his distribution of pro-Hamas propaganda on campus. His supporters argue he's being persecuted for exercising free speech. And Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed, quote-unquote, reservations about the U.S. proposed 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, calling the idea great and correct, end quote, in theory, but raising concerns over its implementation. Speaking at a press conference yesterday, Putin questioned how the ceasefire would be verified and insisted that it must address the, quote, root causes of the crisis, end quote. Putin has previously framed Ukraine's current government as part of the conflict's root causes. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. Guys, for his part, President Trump responded yesterday after Putin had gave his press conference and basically sort of hinted that maybe he likes the ceasefire, but wanted more. And President Trump responded saying he put out a promising statement, but it was not complete. I'd love to meet with him or talk with him, but we have to get it over fast. He said that we're going to see whether or not Russia is there, meaning able to just kind of get past some of these details and get to a final agreement. He said, quote, if they're not, it will be a very disappointing moment for the world. That's President Trump. So, and look, this is the dilemma here. Trump's trying to broker this thing. He did. And it's obviously was bumpy with Zelensky in the White House recently, but now with Putin, it's just difficult to trust Putin at all that he's going to stick to his word. I mean, he seems potentially emboldened here that he's going to just keep trying to get what he wants. When he says the root causes of the crisis, that's essentially their code word for them trying to get all of these longstanding things that he wants, like a pro-Russian government, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, he's such a trustworthy guy. I mean, I can't imagine why we'd be struggling to.
Right.
I think that what is happening here, regardless of opinions on how it's been handled, and with the whole Zelensky thing and all the chaos around it, you're dealing with unpredictable people. You're dealing with circumstances that have a deep-rooted history, and you're dealing with somebody who, in Putin is essentially relatively a madman. I mean, he's not a reasonable person, right? And doesn't present as one. So this is not going to be as easy as negotiating between two people or two parties that have a sane way of looking at the world. It's much more complicated than that. I'm sure Trump and the government realize that, but this is another sort of, hurdle that has to be gotten over. It's, you would think that it would be in the interest of everyone to end it. But if one party wants control over another, it's going to be much harder than just saying, let's come to the table and agree.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you can't kind of remove from the calculation here that you are trying to negotiate with somebody who is a crazy person, right? Who is not prone to telling the truth, is not, prone to doing anything that is anywhere close to showing a modicum of humility, talking about, Putin here. So, I don't think you can remove that from the situation, but it's also an interesting dynamic because if you don't negotiate, right, if you don't come to the table, what's the alternative? So I find it odd that Trump is constantly being berated for the fact that he's having conversation. It's like, well, okay, I agree that Putin is a madman, that he's a dictator, that he's ruthless, and that he's all these terrible things. But the alternative to talking with him and attempting to peacefully reach some sort of ceasefire or peaceful negotiation, what's the alternative to having these conversations?
Yeah, there's really not a lot at this point. So, hopefully we can get some progress on this. Hopefully Trump's efforts do provide some fruit in getting this thing to grind to a halt here eventually, because it's been far too long. And it's high time this thing kind of came and drew to a close. So we'll be praying for that for sure. All right, we're going to head over to the focus story now, and Syria is another area where things are just falling off the rails here. Dire reports of mass killings. One expert sounding the alarm about just how dangerous it is on the ground and what's going on. So what's the story here?
Yeah, Joel Veldkamp, he's the head of international communications at Christian Solidarity International. We've had him on many times on the show here before. We spoke with him at CBN News about what has been happening, and we know that at least hundreds of people were potentially killed in recent days amid this unrest that we have seen in Syria. He said that there were really about 717 names. This was as of Monday. So now, we're at the end of the week now, and most of this has apparently subsided, the killings, but that's almost 1,000 people. That's hundreds of people, mostly part of the Alawite Muslim civilian population. And so there was a lot of questions around whether or not Christians were being targeted. Joel Veldkamp said that's not necessarily the case. It wasn't systematic. There were a couple of Christians, as we have talked about at CBN, who were killed, but the Alawite Muslim civilians were the ones who were apparently killed. And, again, hundreds of people here. Veldkamp said that armed forces loyal to Syria's new government had attacked the region. And again, most of the people living in this particular part of Syria where this happened were part of that Alawite Muslim sect. He said this is a sect of Islam that the jihadist worldview would consider an apostate sect, meaning they're outside the law, they're outside of protection, they can be killed, they can be enslaved, really seen as worse than Christians and Jews, as some jihadists will say. He said this is kind of what we were afraid of 3 months ago when the Assad regime was overthrown by this rebel coalition.
What is Veldkamp's sort of biggest fear in everything going on right now and how it may unfold?
Yeah, I mean, he's very fearful that this is going to continue to get worse, right? Even if the current killings have subsided right now. He said, look, despite the horror that was sort of inflicted under former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, he noted that those who overthrew the regime, and these are people who are under the control of a man named Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, these are jihadists. He said these are people who have really been preaching a horrible message of Sunni Muslim supremacy. He said, I'm afraid it's very bad and it is likely to get worse. And so, again, when we talk about the Christian population, right now we're talking about the Alawite Muslims. I think his fear is the Christian minorities who, things were not perfect under Assad. Is this going to develop into a thing where Christians are being targeted? So I think that's the concern. That's the fear of where this unfolds. You end up with a government that is jihadi now and not just, evil and difficult like it was before. Now you have another level potentially of this.
Right. Like previously you had one of these sort of dictators that puts on a pretty face for the globe and does a lot of this stuff sort of a little more hidden, not so out in the open. but everyone knows it, and you kind of deal with them that way. So it's kind of a massive lesser of two evils sort of situation here. And now you have, a really massive evil going on with essentially a jihadist government in place right now. And what happens next here? I mean, what are they saying? What are we looking at here as far as where things go?
Yeah, I mean, really, you have this issue with al-Shura, the new leader of, and by the way, this is a guy who was the leader of al-Qaeda in Syria. If you go back a little bit. So when you talk about jihadists, this person who is now in charge of Syria was a leader in al-Qaeda in that country. That adds a little bit of uncertainty and chaos. He had pledged previously that he was going to respect Christians. And so far, Veldkamp said they had actually held to that. When you look at the CNN report on this earlier this week, the United Nations Human Rights Office, they said entire families were killed in this violence, that some estimates again said 800 people. I said 717 before. It seems to be in the hundreds, obviously. And it's important to note that this clash unfolded between groups, again, loyal to the new regime and those affiliated with al-Assad. So it was sort of the new regime and the old regime, those people clashing. And so we don't really know what's going to happen. Now, al-Shura did say he was going to assemble a committee to investigate what unfolded and that he would hold those responsible accountable. So we're going to have to wait and see. But based on his history with al-Qaeda, there are a lot of questions, obviously.
Yeah, and look, we've seen over the years, Dave Eubank from Free Burma Rangers has done work in Syria. He's usually in Burma or Iraq, but also has been operating in Syria. They help people on front lines, and man, you see the dire need that was in that country over the years in those times, and then that's under Assad, and then now you have this regime coming in and all this instability there, and so it's really feels like a powder keg just ready to go off.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like something we've talked about similarly on this podcast, I think, earlier this week, Dan. We're dealing with people who are in this holy war type situation too. So it's like mutually assured destruction is not necessarily something that's a threat to this group of radicals. So how do you deal with a situation like this when it is prone to such incredible violence? You still have to address it, right? I mean, you don't want to ignore this kind of violent persecution, this deadly persecution that's unfolding. But the responses to it have to be a bit more measured, and you have to negotiate, and you have to figure out how you want to handle it. But I think it's important that it's in the United States, especially when we're seeing instances explicitly of Christian persecution, is we stand up and send a very clear message about that, because I think the United States, we have the bully pulpit around the world, and it's critical that we as kind of the world superpower, we set the tone for that kind of behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Billy, final thoughts on this?
We got to pray. We got to pray. I mean, there's so much persecution around the world and chaos. And the last thing the world needs is another country in the Middle East run by jihadis. So, let's just be praying for calmness, sanity, and really just a turn to the truth.
All right. Yeah, definitely need to be praying there for sure. Horrible situation unfolding for Christians potentially, but also for any minorities that don't fall under the approved Islamic sort of umbrella that they have there, and that they have deemed are the ones that are acceptable and the ones that aren't. So certainly praying for everyone involved there. Appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today, Billy. All right, Democrats in disarray. As I mentioned at the top of the podcast, David Brody has the details on that in 30 seconds.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem. Crowds welcome Jesus as king. Rebellion is in the air.
Jesus operates outside our jurisdiction.
Rome will descend on us all.
But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.
The world will never be the same. Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right. Time for the main thing now. And following Trump's resounding victory in November, Democrats really seem in the wake of this disorganized and sort of struggling to find a unified response that sticks. CBN's David Brody breaks down the fallout from last week's joint session speech and what it signals for the next 4 years. That's today's main thing.
We will win. We will win. We won't rest. We won't rest.
Just like this clumsy attempt at a rallying cry, Democrats have appeared uncoordinated and off track since President Trump's election victory.
The President of the United States.
And that theme continued Tuesday during the president's speech to Congress. Caught flat-footed by an election victory and calls for change, Democrats couldn't come up with a cohesive pushback strategy. Some walked out. Others held protest signs, while one rudely interrupted the president's speech.
Remove this gentleman from the chamber.
Once again, I look at the Democrats in front of me, and I realize there is absolutely nothing I can say to make them happy or to make them stand or smile or applaud. Nothing I can do.
That seems to be true. Party leaders like David Axelrod realize the Democrat disconnect is real.
The Democratic Party has, in some ways, become too much seen by too many Americans as the party of elites and institutions that have failed them. I worry that the party of working people, the self-styled party of working people, is perceived by working people as elite and
it's not for
disdainful and removed from their experience.
Polls show it's the GOP now more in sync with Americans on top issues like the economy, taxes, and immigration. That disconnect brings with it a 57% unfavorable rating for Democrats. Longtime party influencer Roland Martin, however, says, don't count them out quite yet.
People who are saying that they're in disarray, that's a level of silliness. And the reason I say that is we always see these stories after there's a loss.
But Martin does acknowledge a communication problem.
Democrats' messaging is horrible. And that is, what they've done is they've passed things, they've supported things that actually benefit the American people. They don't talk about it.
Still, the embrace of leftist ideas has hurt them with the blue-collar base.
If you're Democrat, you have to recognize where people are and now begin to say, hey, either I'm going to stand with, push that hard and suffer the consequences, or I'm going to have to somehow recalibrate.
It's left Democrat politicians with a choice in attempting a strategic comeback. Some are taking the road less traveled, like Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer trying to find common ground with the Trump administration.
I don't want to pretend we're always going to agree, but I will always seek collaboration first. I won't go looking for fights. I won't back down from them either.
Others, like Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, remain never-Trumpers, using provocative rhetoric.
The seed that grew into a dictatorship in Europe a lifetime ago didn't arrive overnight. I'm watching with a foreboding dread what is happening in our country right now.
Two different strategies, but not a true plan. That makes for a bleak future. It's projected that in the next 5 years, liberal states like California, Illinois, and New York will lose congressional seats due to a shrinking population. Conservative states like Texas and Florida are expected to pick up seats.
So you've got to have a much more aggressive Democratic National Committee. It's understanding they've got to stop listening to these overpaid consultants and pollsters who don't understand people.
And if that isn't bad enough, the money is starting to dry up as well, with many top Democrat donors saying they are done with a party that seems out of touch with voters. David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
All right, David, thanks for that report there. Interesting stuff indeed. And of course, parties, both sides will panic anytime they lose an election. I mean, after Biden won in 2020, you had all the media bearing down and saying the Republicans were relegated to the dustbins of history. And then here we are 4 years later, and here it's completely the opposite conversation happening right now. So you never say never, but Democrats certainly need to be, if they want to continue to be relevant, they're going to have to figure out what they want to unify behind and get going with that message, because the one they're bringing out doesn't seem to be resonating. All right, that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
1 John 1:8, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. And that's a convicting one, because we've all got sin we got to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great reminder that we're all equal, right? We're all equally sinners and in need of a savior.
Amen. Amen. Good spot to leave it. And we do that to one degree or another, by the way. It's not just saying, I don't sin. I think we just looking at somebody else and pointing out their sin, we kind of deflect from our own sin. So we can do it subconsciously too and subtly. All right. Good spot to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start Podcast. As always, get on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back Monday with more. God bless. Have a great weekend.